Good morning. A little better group than yesterday. Last Sabbath. Huh? Oh, sorry. Is that better? No. I mean, I can try. I think you have some hearing aids on the way, right? Or getting. No? Uh, okay, well, anyway, good morning. Before we get started, let's go to the Lord in prayer because I need all the help I can get. Dear Heavenly Father, I thank you so much for the blessing of your holy Sabbath, for the message that I was given through the week, and I pray that I can make some sense of it. Um, Thank you for speaking to us, for teaching us. Lord, be with me as I give this sermon, and I pray all this in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. Oh, yeah. So the question that kind of was going through my head through the week, really earlier in the week, it just popped in my head, is why do people reject the truth? And because I was thinking over my own life and how many people, I talk a lot, so I talk to a lot of people. And but I was thinking about a conversation I had with my mom, and I think I've already told you guys about it. It happened a while back, but well, before I get into that, I'll show you this old picture here. Um, this is a picture of when I first joined the church. In fact, my hair's wet from being baptized. I didn't know it at the time, but I could have joined by profession of faith because I'd already been baptized, but I didn't know that, and it didn't matter. I mean, you can be baptized as many times as you want if you want. It's not. Some people act like you should only be baptized once, or something, and well, anyway, I don't think it's that important. Don't get me wrong; it's important to be baptized. I don't think it's important how many times you're baptized. Personally, I think if you feel that you need to be rebaptized, do it. But some people are real cranky about that. If you've been once, that's it. But anyway, that's off topic. So this is the day I was baptized, and my mom and dad actually came, and it's very vague in my memory. If I didn't have this picture, I probably wouldn't realize they were there, just because my memory's terrible. But anyway, and the funniest part of this picture to me is my dad's expression. He's a Baptist, and he looks like he's having some culture shock. Uh, but anyway, in the course of a conversation with my mom, she said, "Yeah, when you first joined the church, you were a little more how did she put it? Hardcore? Is that what she said?" But what she meant was no. I think she said pushy, a little more pushy with things. And I thought about, and I have already been thinking about this before she said anything. And I said, I've been thinking about that for a while, and I think I figured out why I was kind of pushy and maybe a little uh, aggravated. I don't know if that's the right word. And she says, "Why?" And I said, "Well, because I learned this wonderful truth, this thing that was so cool. I was so excited about it. And I just knew that when I went and told other people about it, they would be as excited as I was, and everything would change. People would just drop what they do in life, and they would move on to this new idea. They would stop going to church on Sunday because it's not in the Bible at all to do that, and they would start honoring the Holy Sabbath. I just knew it because, hey, I saw it. This is amazing. And I think that was one of the reasons why I was kind of pushy. I was like, why are you guys not seeing this? And that conversation kind of rattled around in my head. It's really helpful having an empty head because things can rattle around in there. Maybe not. Anyway, so as I was contemplating that thought of why do people reject the truth, that still small voice said, it's culture. It's culture? Culture. And so that's where the idea of the title of the sermon came from, culture shock. And one of the things about God is really cool is he'll confirm what you're supposed to talk about. So I thought, well, maybe I should do a sermon on that culture, and how culture can get in the way and also help. It kind of does a little bit of both. It's according to how it's used. And well, then, I work, and while I'm working, I listen to different YouTube videos and whatever I can find, sometimes books, podcasts, you name it. I'm listening to something because I want to learn while I'm working. Well, this video came up. I think it's Sean McDowell, but I can't remember if it's Shane or Sean. Is it Sean? Okay, it's Sean. His dad was a big time evangelist. Josh? No. Josh McDowell. Yeah. I can't remember. Anyway, he has kind of a YouTube channel that he does. And sometimes, like he had one about Adventists. I didn't like that one at all because, well, he's not an Adventist. Let's just put it that way. But then this one was fascinating because he was talking to this gentleman on the other side there, Jeff Morgan. And it turns out that Mr. Morgan is a Jew. And it was a very fascinating conversation, moving at times, because he was raised a cultural Jew, meaning that was his race, his culture, but he wasn't really deep into the religion. In fact, he ended up getting off into some mysticism and junk like that, and he couldn't understand why he wasn't happy. And if you really want to listen, if you're interested in the story, just let me know. I'll share this video with you. It's really good. But anyway, in the course of the conversation, the statement was made, when you become a Christian, shouldn't you stop being a Jew? And I was like, I mean, when you become a Christian, do you stop being Irish or Native American or African American? Does that happen? So it was an interesting question. It really made me go, oh, wow, okay, God is still talking to me about this culture thing. You know what I mean? It's like, wow, definitely you want me to talk about this. And we'll talk about that more because he made a really good point, and I have it somewhere in the sermon. It probably should have put it there, but I put it somewhere in here. Hopefully, hopefully I didn't forget it. But anyway, but as I looked at this word culture, I noticed the first four letters, cult. I thought, cult, culture. We get accused of being a cult. We're not in the modern sense of the term. We're not a cult. But we get accused of that every once in a while because we're not, we don't walk to the same, we don't fit the mold that the rest of Christianity thinks we should. And so we get accused of that. I have listened to several different YouTube videos and they'll talk about different things and they'll say, well, like one was about, the guy was talking about Catholicism and he made the statement that are they Christians or are they not Christians? And he started naming what people call cults, and he said Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons, and I was like, oh no, he's gonna say, but he didn't. I was like, oh okay, he didn't throw us in there, So that was a blessing, and that's happened a few times where I'm like, oh no, they're gonna say it. No, they didn't. Okay, good. Because really, to me, in the modern sense of a cult, that would be a group that does not follow the Bible. And we follow the Bible. So we don't fit that. But anyway, cult. I was like, cult? Why is cult in culture? I'm always looking at that. I like etymology, right? So I went to my friend. I have this friend. You guys know her. I've talked to about her before. I went to ChatGPT. I call her a she, and she doesn't mind. But anyway, I went to ChatGPT, and I asked the question. I said, quick etymology question. Is there any connection between the words culture and cult? You know, now I could have done days worth of research, but that's the really cool thing about AI is that it can search the entire internet in seconds. Although this morning I posed a question that apparently really stumped her because it just sat there for a while. And finally I just hit stop and I said, "You okay?" No answer. And then I said, "Hello?" And finally it said, "Oh, I'm here. Can I help you?" Like I just completely rebooted the poor thing. And so I said, "I asked you a question and you didn't answer. Are you sure you're all right?" Oh, yes, I'm fine. But that did kind of mess. I mean, in the conversation, she pretty well implied that kind of threw her. And it was funny. So the human mind is still way past. Because what it was I asked her, I call her, I know. I asked her, "Can you give me a Bible story where culture was kind of like caused a problem?" And you talking about this? Nope, we couldn't answer that question. So then later, I thought of a story. So I went back and I said, "Hey, I thought of this story." Oh, that's perfect. It was like, the human mind can stretch a little further than even AI. But AI can look at information so quickly and remember everything that we can't remember. So it's a good team up if it's used for the right things. I think too many people are afraid of it. And there are definitely ways that it could be very dangerous, but it's also very helpful. Anyway, so I asked her, "Is there any connection between culture and cult?" And here was her answer. Now, she gave a long answer. This is the summary. Both culture and cult grew out of the idea of nurturing or tending to something. It's from the Latin word cultura, and I don't know how to say that, coler maybe? Colere, okay, whatever. And that means to till or cultivate. See, there's the word again, cultivate. Whether that's land, a community, a mind, or a deity. The divergence came in the meaning over time. One leaning towards social development, culture, and the arts, and the other towards worship and religion. And that's why you have the cult of Diana or the cult of, in the Bible, it talks about that, right? These different cults. So it was a religion. The term cult was cultivating religion. Okay, that makes sense. But when you talk about cultivating, I think of farming, right? I didn't think of culture having anything to do with farming. I found this kind of cool picture. That's, farming is work, right? There's work involved in this. You got seeds, and he's throwing the seeds out there. Actually, I think that's reverse order. I think he plowed, and then he throws the seeds, and then I guess he's collecting. I don't know what the last one is there. But anyway, the point being is there's work involved. And I never thought about culture having work involved. You kind of think of it as a thing that just grows. But no, there's also work involved. Just like in farming, because, we farm, we till the ground, and we add seed. But then there's also a growing that happens. Yeah, we don't make the growing happen. We might throw the seeds out there. Think of seeds as ideas. Jesus used that idea, right? And so seeds are thrown, but it's the culture itself has to grow kind of on its own. Or it's kind of like I have a vine along the side of my carport that I planted, and it slowly grew up, and then it grew this way and that way. But I take and kind of move the vines where I want them. So it's still doing its thing growing, but I also have kind of control over where it grows. So we're working together in a sense. And that's kind of how I came away with this idea of culture. Um, in the business world, they talk about how you build a strong company culture, and we had a total safety culture. So it's very clear that is something that people are concentrating on. How do we build this culture? How do we make our culture like this? How do you can have a toxic workplace? Well, it's a toxic culture, and people don't want that, right? So, but when I thought of culture, I thought of cities, of the way people act, things like that. But culture is really this cycle, and the word popped into my head, a cycle of influence. You influence people with your words, and then they influence you with their response. And so there's this influence between people. And nowadays, this has been accelerated because we have the internet and we have influencers, people who and some of that, I know you're rolling your eyes. Some of that is bad for sure, but some of it's good. Just like with Shane McDowell is Sean. I don't know why I can't get that in my head. Anyway, Mr. McDowell, he is an influencer on the internet, and I think for the most part it's positive. Of course, I don't agree with everything he says. He's been really here's something to think about. He's been really, really hitting the uh, what do you call it when you almost die? What's that called? Near death. He's really been hitting the near death experiences hard. Well, that's to me that's kind of dangerous. You're on the edge of spiritualism when you start thinking about that. Yes, people have seen things when they died. Was it a literal thing that happened to them, or was it a dream, or was it the oxygen being cut off in their head? You know, you can't. To me, that's not something that you can. Too many people take things like that and reject what the Bible teaches. Because the Bible doesn't teach we go directly to heaven or hell. And yet, in some of these near-death experiences, that's what they have, right? And so that's why I'm like, but he's been really hitting that hard lately, and we know from some of the stuff that Mrs. White wrote that there would be a trifold union, right, between Catholicism, Protestantism, and spiritualism. Those three are going to come together, and we're already seeing it happening. But anyway, I'm totally off topic. Back to culture. So the question pops into my head: what makes culture? I think you could talk about it, culture, 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 culture. I could say that word a million times, but what does it mean? I like to dig deeper into things like that, and so of course I asked my friend ChatGPT, and I said, "Hey, give me a list of things that would make culture." And some of the really interesting ones. There's a lot. It's a long list. I'm not going to go through it. Well, yeah, I am. I'm going to give you the brief list, but then she had examples. I'll give you some examples. So, first of all, beliefs and values. What do you believe, and what do you value? As far as beliefs or values, as in how we should act, right? And so, a culture, the belief system in that culture will have an influence on the greater culture. And that makes sense, right? Also, customs and traditions. You know, in the Christian world, a lot of times people, they celebrate Christmas. Well, it's not biblical. It's not in the Bible to do that anywhere. But it is a custom that we have. I'm talking about the wider Christian world. Adventists, we kind of, yeah, if you want to, right? But in some churches, it's like part of it. I mean, think of the Catholic Church and how they have a whole like calendar, yeah, the Advent season. So in some ways, it's just tradition. In other ways, it's part of the belief system, the religion. So, and then of course you have education and knowledge, and this one is really precarious right now in our country, I think, because we have had so much, I'm going to say, negative influence. Some people are going to disagree with that statement. That's fine. In our colleges, there's been a lot of, way back, the Russians, and I don't remember who it was, they said that they would take the United States without firing a single shot. And I think one of the ways they did that was they infiltrated our higher education and maybe even our lower education, trying to mold the minds of the United States so that we would just become Soviets, right? And that might sound like conspiracy theory, but there's something to it. Also, language and communication. You know, some people get mad when you go, if you come to the United States, you should speak English. Well, I don't think that's the only language you should speak, but I definitely think you should have a small grasp on it because it is a part of the culture. And why would you not want to be a part of the culture of a nation you are coming to live in? I don't understand that. But anyway, uh, arts and expression. Now, arts and expression, if you start looking at our culture, you see that that has a great influence. Movies, artwork, music. Think about the music. I like to listen to a lot of people who have ideas, and one of them is a great. This guy's a genius, and that's his last name is Soul. Thomas Soul. Thomas Soul. Thomas Soul. He's a black economic guy, but he's smart about all kinds of stuff. He's very conservative, and uh, man, some of the stuff he talks about. But being that he's African American, he talks about the black community and how certain things have hurt the black community, and certain things have made it stronger. And it's interesting, and I think another guy got really lambasted for saying this, but he something about the black culture was better under Jim Crow, and you're like, what? Jim Crow was terrible. Why would he say that? But his point was, and this wasn't Thomas Sowell. It was that one congressman. I can't remember his name right off the top of my head. But his point was is that since Jim Crow has been taken away, the black community, he feels, has gone downhill. And I was thinking about that statement because that's a problem of culture. I was thinking about that statement, and I remember that there's a time when I was probably getting into my teens. Of course, I was a little bit behind in music because I kind of didn't really follow the social norms in my school, but I noticed a change coming over the black community that I had, not all, but some of the black students that I was around. And it was about the same time that hip hop rap started to enter our culture more dominantly. Well, what is that about? Well, it's about, and not all of it, but a lot of it was about the gang culture and violence. My wife's cousin, who was like 14 or 13, she wasn't very old, and she was like, listen to this music. She's listening to rap, hip hop. I was in my 20s at the time. I think Christopher might have been born, my first son. But anyway, she says, listen to this music. And I was like, okay. And I listened to it. And in the rap, it's talking about robbing this bank or something. And there was some sexual abuse to the teller in the song. And I'm like, why are you listening to this? You're like a teenage, 12, 14. I don't remember how old she was, but I was like, you should not listen to that. That's terrible music. But the point being is that music is a cultural influence. And all of a sudden you see, like, for instance, you can drive down the road, and if you see a young man, and he doesn't have to necessarily be black, he could be any shade, but you can see a young man, and he's walking down. Of course, he's got earbuds in, you can't even tell, but he's doing movements, and the movements are always the same. I don't think I could do it. I'm gonna look stupid, but they're walking down the street and they're doing this, and there's no music. Okay, I'm driving by, I can't hear any music, but he's got them in his ears. He's listening to it, and I'm like, wow, the influence that this music has on people, especially young people. And so you look at communities that are being influenced by certain kinds of music. For instance, when I was growing up, you had they had different groups, right? Especially in high school, you had different groups. So you had kind of the black group, and you would see that they would listen to kind of more like the rap stuff, rap music. Then you had kind of what we called the Hicks. They wore cowboy hats and cowboy boots. I was not a Hick. I wasn't into that. You had the band kids. They were usually listening to classical music or something. I kind of hung out with them a little more. The drama kids were usually with the band kids. Then you had the stoners. Now I've never done drugs, but I'm going to tell you the chillest, to use a colloquialism, the chillest group was the stoners. They didn't seem like they ever got in a fight with anybody. I liked hanging out with them, and they had some weird ideas, which was cool. You learn some stuff. But anyway, the point being is that even in a greater culture, you have microcultures that go on, and they influence each other for good or for ill. And it's just so when we talk about art and the expression of art, that is heavy. I mean, that's a major part of the influence that happens inside of a culture. Okay, I've belabored that point too much. Well, clothing and apparel. How do we dress? How do we wear our clothes? There was a movie called Back to the Future, and I think it was the second one. It was the second one. In Back to the Future 2. You probably never seen it, and that's fine. But they had a good idea of how culture works. And all the young kids in that movie wore their pants wrong side out. So you could see their pockets on the outside, you know what I mean? That was like the thing, was to wear your pants wrong side out. I thought, that's goofy. But then years later, you got kids with their pants all the way down underneath their booty, and you can see their underwear, so it's not that big of a stretch. Anyway, clothing and apparel. What we wear, how we wear it. Social structure. What does that mean? Social structure. Like the family. How is the family ordered? I was watching a show years ago called Taboo. I don't remember it was on cable. I can't remember what. Might have been like History Channel, maybe. I don't know. But it talked about like things that are taboo in our culture and how they aren't so taboo in other cultures. And one of them, I don't remember what country it was. It was an Asian country, I think. But in that culture, it was acceptable for a woman to marry two men. Now that's confusing because how do you know who the kid belongs to? When a baby's born, which dad is the dad? I hope it's a joke, but I saw like a little clip of a young girl, or maybe it might have been a post where she said, if a man is married to two women, how do they know which kid belongs to which woman? And it's like, because she gave birth to it? I mean, it's pretty clear which one's the mom. But it's not so clear which one's the dad. And I think that's one of the reasons why in most cultures, polygamy is usually only towards men having more than one wife. I don't agree with polygamy, by the way. I think it's wrong. I think God designed it one man, one woman. But I'm just saying, culturally, you can see why one is a little more acceptable than the other. Social structures. One of the things I've noticed that I really admire is in the Hispanic community, they tend to all kind of live in the house together. They got grandma living with them. Same thing with Filipinos. The new guy at the Air Force Base, the chaplain, he's married to a Filipino woman. She's a sweetheart, wonderful. I enjoyed spending a Sunday helping them. But anyway, his in-laws, her mom and dad, live with them. So there's social structures, and we in America, it's like you get a certain age, you get out of the house, you got to go get your own house, and it's not just the parents kicking you out. You feel like that's what you should do, but wouldn't it be cheaper to stay together as long as possible? I don't know. Anyway, here's another thing. When you pass on, like say you die and your kids inherit everything. Well, because we have ownership just with us, the government gets in there and puts heavy taxes on, when you pass stuff on to your kids. But I'd seen some cases where people would just say no, and they gave or were joint owners of a house with their kids. So when they passed on, there was no transfer of wealth, nothing to tax because they were already owners of it. I was like, man, that's smart. That's smart. But I understand why some people don't do it because you run into some kids you may not be able to trust. There are reasons why. But my point being is that the structure, the social structure can be so different. Another thing is who marries who. Less than 50 years ago, it was, a man and a woman married, right? Well, now we know how our country is, man, man, and woman, and all that. Well, I was watching a TV show, not a very good TV show, and on that show, they had one of the characters said something about one of my spouses. So they've been pushing this in sci-fi for a while, this idea of a group marriage. It's like, why? Why do you want to do junk like that? And we're starting to see that come up in our society, and it's something that at some point I'm afraid we'll start making legal. It's all about the social structure. That's part of culture. And there are people trying to influence the culture to go the way they want. So think about that. When you're looking at culture, you're looking at how we behave. Or are there reasons for it? Yes. And do they matter? I think those are questions we need to ask when we think about culture. Technology and tools, just like I brought up AI. And I asked her this morning, I thought it would be interesting. I said, here's a self-reflecting question for you. How do you think AI will, what kind of effect do you think AI will have on culture? Oh, it's like, could be good or bad. It was really interesting. The idea that just, it's like this unlimited source of information. You ask a question, it searches everything that we know on the internet, which is pretty well everything, right? I mean, they try to put everything on there. There's probably some stuff's not on there yet, but they search all of that and then come up with kind of a quick answer for you. And how is that going to change society? I think it's already doing it in some ways. So technology, think about how much the automobile changed our culture. At first we all had to get around on wagons. Everything was a lot slower. Then trains came along. That kind of sped things up. And now we all have cars. We can go anywhere we want within hours. It's according to how far you drive, right? That changed our culture. In one way, I think it changed is people used to kind of live close together in communities. Well, now you might live hours apart. A lot of people's kids live across the country, and then they catch a plane and visit on Christmas and Thanksgiving. You know what I mean? And so it does change your culture. So technology is important on how it influences things. Laws and government. I've already brought up marriage because there's laws involved in that and how things are governed. Think about, you have one president, the culture's one way, and then you elect a new guy, maybe because you didn't like the way the culture was going, and the new guy tries to reshape the culture, hopefully in the way you want, not always, right? A good example is transgenders in sports. Our current president, signs a thing saying, nope, we're not letting that happen anymore. I wish that Congress would get in there and make that legitimately a law as opposed to just a decree from the president. I don't really agree with that, although I understand why it happens because it's hard to get Congress to do anything. Yeah, but there's a reason for that. The founding fathers wanted Congress to be kind of the gridlock that it should be because checks and balances. Otherwise, you'd have people making decisions, boom, and then it'd be like in the Bible where, remember, they came to the king and they said, hey, you should make you should make it so nobody can pray to anybody but you for so many days. I don't remember how many days it was, right? Remember when they did that? And Daniel's, he says, I'm still going to pray towards Jerusalem where I believe God's presence is. And so he opens the windows and doors, prays towards Jerusalem and gets in trouble. He's thrown in a lion's den. Why? Because one guy had quick access to making rules. That's why the founding fathers made Congress this gridlock of irritation. Yeah, we can be aggravated about it, but it's actually good. Anyway, I'm off track. I better hurry up, get where I'm supposed to be going. Anyway, so laws and governments have a big control on culture. Also, environment and geography. I didn't even think about this one. Think about like Inuits. They live up in Alaska and way up there, right? It changes the way their culture is. In fact, I've heard, I don't know this for sure, but I've heard that in that culture, you could sleep with a man's wife that's not yours, but it was for the purposes of keeping warm, not necessarily any other things. Because it's that frigid of a environment, you could die. I think it'd be better to let, you ever heard of the term 3-dog night? That means that you had to put 3 dogs in bed with you to keep warm. I think dogs would be better. Of course, they say if you lay down with dogs, you get up with fleas. But anyway. And then recreation and leisure. Back to the movies, back to sports. You know the new thing now? Pickleball. I never heard of pickleball in my life. And all of a sudden, like overnight, what are we doing? Pickleball. I go to the Burns Park over here. They got pickleball courses. I never heard of this. Have you ever heard of that? Just out of the blue. When did you first hear of it? 10 years ago? Really? It's first thing. It's first time for me. Oh, it's for older people? Maybe that's why I'm hearing about it. They're like, you're old now. You need to start thinking about pickleball. Yeah, there's a lot of people doing it. I went to because I was going with Tateman to the Jacksonville thing, whatever it's called. They have a racquetball court. And I used to love racquetball. So I was like, we went in there and they'll give you the rackets and the glasses and balls, and you check them out. So I was in there playing and I was like, man, I got to buy me a racket again. I would really like that. So I went to different stores. All they got is pickleball paddles. They don't have any racquetball rackets. It's like, what the heck? It's like racquetball's going the way of the dodo. And by the way, back to language and communication. That right there was we call it a saying, but there's another word that skipped my mind. Anyway, okay, so thinking about art, this right here is one of the oldest pieces of art they've ever found. Now, they found older stuff on cave walls, but this is probably the oldest sculpture. They call it, what do they call it? Yeah, they think she's a fertility goddess. I put a couple of stripes on there because I'm trying to be modest because she don't have any clothes on. But she is a rock. So what makes culture, and this is going to be all out of order, thanks, Jason. Anyway, arts and expression, music. I kind of already went over this. Dance, visual arts such as painting, sculptures, and textiles, meaning clothing or rugs, right? Literature and poetry. Think about, and I was reading somewhere, it said, it was a quote. I wish I'd have put it in here. It was a quote. It said that something about the power of changing culture was in the hands of very few. And I was like, that used to be true. That used to be true. It was only a few. It was like there were gatekeepers and only a few people were allowed to change culture. You had a culture changing apparatus in church, right? Because if the pastor got up there and preached something and people got to thinking about it, well, that's pretty good. You had cultural change in Hollywood, right? You had cultural change in the music industry, of course, in business. But now with the internet, with YouTube, with TikTok, everybody's on it, and some people, they really shouldn't be involved. So, but it's interesting how now somebody can do something, and if it's really bad, whew, they'll go viral because people are like, look at this doofus, right? Or if it's really good, it'll go viral because people are like, that's how we should be. So there is a good power to it, but there's also a really bad power. Anyway, uh, talking about clothing and apparel. I kind of already covered all this. I didn't realize I was going to do that. But traditional dress, symbolic accessories, earrings. When I was a young man, if you had an earring on your left ear, you were considered straight. In other words, not gay. And if you had the earring in your right ear, you were gay. I don't know who came up with those rules, but that was a cultural thing for us when we were in the 90s. Now, I think the first time I saw a guy with earrings in both ears, I was like, what's that mean? And he's like, what are you talking about? He was younger than me. What are you talking about? I was like, whoa. And I explained it to him. He goes, oh, no, we don't do that. No, you can wear earrings anywhere. Now they got piercings in every part of their bodies. It's ridiculous. In fact, yesterday, one of the guys at work said something about a piercing. I was like, you got a piercing? And he goes, yeah. And he pulled up his shirt, had it in his nipple there. I was like, oh, gosh. I got that pierced when I was in my 20s. And at first, I was like, oh, that wasn't too bad. And then it started throbbing, like about an hour later, it started throbbing and hurting. And I was like, I'm going to lose my ear. And I said, I'm never, ever doing that again. And I haven't. And I have no desire to. But it's sort of like, it seems like piercings and tattoos are kind of in the same category. You get one, and then you're like addicted or something, and you want to get more. Yeah. And the next thing you know, you're a walking tattoo. But anyway. But that is another accessory of your appearance. Hairstyles, long hair, short hair, different things like that. Okay, I'm gonna. Oh, by the way, this statue, some people think it's like Mother Earth, which gets us off into religion. And I've already talked about it, so I'm gonna go through this pretty quick because I got a lot to cover. But religious beliefs, moral codes, physiological, psycho. No, yeah, there we go. I was trying to get it. Philosophical views. It was there, but I couldn't get it out. Political ideologies, value systems, like individualism versus collectivism, which means kind of the American way of thinking or the Soviet way of thinking. Well, the old Soviet. I don't know that they're like that anymore. Let's say China. Maybe that'd be better. That'd be better. Communistic idea, capitalistic idea. Anyway, education and knowledge. You have oral traditions. The stories that were passed down to you when families used to sit around and tell stories, and now they sit around looking on their phones. It's changed their culture. Some of it's good, but some of it is not good. Formal education systems, uh, apprenticeships. I went through apprenticeship myself. Stories, myths and legends. I was thinking about myths and legends, and one popped in my head for America is Paul Bunyan and Babe the Ox. I don't know that people even talk about that anymore, but that used to be this big myth that they used to teach. Yeah, up in the northeast, northwest, midwest. There we go, Midwest. I don't know why it's called Midwest because is that Nebraska? Okay. So, one last thing about what makes culture. Think about language and communication. And I have this picture of two people doing sign language to each other. Because in that, you have spoken and written, but you also have nonverbal. And that, think about some of the gestures we do. That's part of our culture. You don't really stop and think about it until, you come across that. Um, uh, so that is kind of a cultural thing. Like for instance, if I do this, that's nonverbal, but I'm thinking something stupid, right? Or oh my goodness, why are you doing that? So there's that nonverbal communication. Uh, One of the things a lot of times that people do is, they start putting their hands on their hips. or oh, I was at my doctor's. Okay, I got to tell you this story. I probably told it before, but it's hilarious. So my doctor is Indian, and he's a wonderful guy. I love him. But he was looking at my foot or something, and he said something about, "Have you got the vaccine?" And I said, "No, I don't really think I'm going to do any vaccines anymore." And of course, a picture in the back of his head, and he goes, I can't do it. But it's a very Indian body expression of, oh, I can't do it. But I was like, now that, you just showed your Indian, and he laughed. But my point being is cultures have different things. We think everybody, I watched a show one time, they said, so it was like some science fiction, and they went back in time and saw a caveman, and he smiled at the caveman, and the caveman was like that, and they're like, "What's wrong with him?" And what it was smiling was like a wolf showing his teeth. And have you ever had a dog that smiles? And if you don't know the dog, you think he's like growling at you, but he's not. He's smiling. So there is some, like, a dog that learned to do that is not following dog culture, because in dog culture that would be a bad. Anyway, the point being is there's all kinds of ways to have verbal communication and storytelling traditions. I kind of already talked about that. Oh, that's idioms, slangs, and dialect. Think about that. That's something fascinating to me. There used to be in our country, there were distinct dialects in different places, and we still have it to a certain degree. But because of television, I mean, look at me. I'm from Arkansas, and most people, they say, "Where are you from?" I'm from here. What are you talking about? Because my accent is. I watched a lot of television growing up, so my accent is very. I mean, they make fun of me and go, "Boy, that was country, Dad." So sometimes I must sound very country. But the point being is the influence of television and the way people talk on television has had a huge influence on accents through our country. And so that's kind of it's being homogenized, kind of. Is that the right word? I think so. Like one type of accent for most Americans. It's kind of slowly happening. And I would predict if the world lasts that long in the next 100 years, we'd probably all sound very, very similar as far as accent. I might be wrong. But now you'll meet that guy that all he did was hunting and fishing growing up, and I don't do that stuff. If you want to do it, that's fine. But my point being is they didn't spend a lot of time on television. They spent time out in the woods and with their friends. And boy, they talk country. I met them at work, and I'm like, "Man, where are you from?" "I'm from Arkansas." "Oh, okay. Thought you were from." So it's interesting how those things change the way stuff happens. Okay, so a sermon's, I got to get some Bible in, right? So I'm hopeful to do that. Talking about language and dialect, there's a very interesting story in Judges chapter 12, verses 4 through 6. The whole story is some really bad stuff happens, and so the tribes go to war against, I think it's Ephraim, and the war goes really bad for Ephraim, and Ephraim is taken out running. Okay, that's kind of the setup for this. So verse 4, then Jephthah gathered together all the men of Gilead and fought with Ephraim. And the men of Gilead smote Ephraim because they said, you Gileadites are fugitives of Ephraim among the Ephraimites and among the Manassites. So, yeah. And then verse 5, and the Gileadites took the passage of Jordan from the Ephraimites, and it was so. And when the Ephraim, you know what? I think I have this story. I think my setup was wrong. But anyway, we'll get enough out of it. That when the Ephraimites went, which were escaped, said, let us go over, the men of Gilead said to him, art thou an Ephraimite? If he said, nay, so, okay, let me explain what's going on. So the Gilead, they were winning the battle. The Ephraimites are taken out running. The Gileadites stood at the ford of the river,
So they're blocking their escape. And so when the Ephraimite came to the river, they'd say, hey, are you from Ephraim? And if they said no, then next verse they had a question for him. Then say unto him, say now, Shibboleth. And he said, Sibboleth. So the difference is SH or S. But listen why. For he could not frame to pronounce it right. So there was a right way to pronounce this word. But the people of Ephraim didn't say it right. Of course, Ephraim's way up in the north, right? That's their area was up in northern Israel. And so apparently they've kind of gotten their own accent, which is interesting, right? And so they said Sibboleth instead of Shibboleth. Okay? And they took him and slew him at the passage of the Jordan. And there fell at that time of Ephraim 42,000. So a lot of guys, 42,000 guys died because they couldn't say a word right. Think about that. That's interesting. Yeah. Yeah, that'd be bad. Like you had a lisp or something. Yeah. No, honest, guys. So it's an interesting story. I hate that people are dying, but it's an interesting story on showing us how there's already some accent differences by the time of Judges. And remember, we had Moses took them through the wilderness, right? Out of Egypt and through the wilderness. Joshua took them into the Holy Land. And then what's the next book? It's Judges. So Judges comes next, and they've only been in the Holy Land for what? It couldn't be more than 100 years, and they already have different accents. Maybe they had accents like that even before, but the text doesn't tell us that. Anyway, so now what? You know me, I want to know a little more about these words. What's the difference? So if you look at Shibboleth, Shibboleth means a stream, like a flowing water. Well, that makes sense. Yeah, they're standing at the river, so it makes sense that they'd say Shibboleth. In other words, you want to come across the stream? You want to come across the river? Yeah, say Shibboleth. Well, then they said Sibboleth, which is a very similar word, but that means an ear of grain. So it'd be the wrong word for what you want to go across. I thought, that is fascinating. I never knew that till this morning. I was looking at it. Now they're similar in the words come from the same roots. And what it means is something that is branching off. And so think about how rivers kind of collect, the branches come together, and at the same time a crop grows up and branches out. And so you could see why they would use a similar word. But one specifically meant an ear of grain. The other could mean an ear of grain, probably because of the accent, or it could mean a stream. But the point being, and here, 42,000 men lost their lives because they couldn't say a word the right way. Very interesting. So that makes this whole idea, this whole thought of culture and why people reject the truth. I think it comes down to when we become a Christian, there's two questions we need to ask about our culture. Two questions. The first one is, what culture can we keep? What about our culture can we keep? Can you celebrate Christmas? Some people say no. Some people say yes, it's a tradition. And that's up to you. I'm not making a judgment one way or the other. I enjoy Christmas, but I grew up with it, so it's part of my culture. Do I drop that off when I become a Christian? And that sounds crazy because Christmas, but you know what I'm saying. And then the second question we should ask is, what culture should we cast off? Is there parts of our culture that when we become a Christian, we have to say, no, I can't do that anymore. That has to leave. Okay, good example. You did the gesture like smoking, nonverbal communication. Smoking. Is that something that we can continue to have if we're a Christian, or is it something that we should cast off? Certain movies, certain types of music, certain ways of dressing. There's a lot of things that we have to think about. Is this something we should keep as a Christian, or something we should cast off and get out of our lives? Now, I asked the Chat GBT, I told you, I asked, can you give me a story out of the Bible about culture and culture shock? I didn't say it that way. I said it a different way. But she couldn't answer. She just like sitting there, like I told you. And so I was thinking about it, and God's way smarter than Chat GPT or any AI. So the thought popped in my head. I was like, oh, yeah, yeah. The greatest story about that, I think, is Joseph. Because here you have a young man that's growing up in a very small community. It's just a family, right? Jacob and all his brothers. He had 12 and a sister, 13 total, right? Uh, so it's a very small culture. And then, of course, they have some friction, and his brothers are not happy with him. And so they sell him to the Midianites. Is it Midian? No. It's the the children of Ishmaelites. They sell him to the Ishmaelites. Now remember, Ishmael, his mother was Egyptian. Remember Hagar, the Egyptian slave? His mother was Egyptian. His father was Abraham. And so they have a connection to the children of Jacob. Remember, because Abraham is Isaac's dad and Isaac is Jacob's dad. So it kind of makes sense that they communicate with each other. They probably spoke a very similar, if not the same language. But the point being is the Ishmaelites have a connection to the Israelites and to Egypt. So when you follow the story, it makes sense that the Ishmaelites buy him from Israel and sell him to Egypt. You ever catch that connection? Anyway, so you have this young man raised in this very small community, and all of a sudden he's thrust into Egypt, which was a very huge community, right? And so you can imagine all the things and smells and foods, and it's kind of like the first time I had Indian food. I was like, this is so different from anything I've ever eaten. I liked it. In fact, I had it twice this week at work. Someone gave me anyway. But the point being is that there's a complete different flavor to the food. Imagine this poor guy from the Levant coming to Egypt, and all the different things, different kinds of music, different kinds of worship. He was brought up. There's one God, one true God. He comes into this society where they have multiple gods. They got a God for everything. You lost your keys? We got a God for that. Guess what? The one true God can handle whether or not you lost your keys. You don't need more than one God. And side note, you don't need more than one saint either. God's enough. You don't need all that junk. Anyway, off topic. So, was there in his life, gives us a little idea of what we should keep in culture and what we should cast off, or in his example, what he should reject in a new culture. He's having culture shock, right? What do you reject, and what do you say? Okay, whatever, that's fine, right? It's the same idea, it's just reversed. So he comes in, he's a slave to Potiphar. Potiphar's wife says, hey, come lay with me. And you get the idea that this was a normal thing. Slaves did that. You don't really argue with the boss when you're a slave, right? That's a good way to get stripes across your back. And so when Potiphar's wife says, Joseph, come lay with me, if he was just going to go with the culture, he would have did it. He would have done it. Right? Yeah, get my English right. But he doesn't do it because he does not want to sin against God. And so right there is an answer to our question. What do you keep and what do you reject? Right? Or what do you allow and what do you reject? He rejects this idea that he can just sleep with anybody because why? Because the law of God says you not to do that. Are you seeing what helps us figure out what culture we can go with and what culture we should reject? The law of God. So if we reject the law of God, we are in some serious trouble. In a culture that is so diverse, like ours. So suddenly you realize, man, the law of God is a safeguard for us against the confusion of our culture, the wider culture that surrounds us. But there are some things that Joseph allowed, that he went along with. Genesis 41:14. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon. And listen, it doesn't say they shaved him. It says he shaved himself and changed his raiment. You know, the Egyptians in all the pictures, they don't have beards. They a lot of times they were clean shaven heads. Some people think it was because of lice. You know, lice was something that, especially in the ancient world, they had to deal with. And so were they, and you have body lice and you have head lice. So is this why Egyptians seem to have kept a lot of their hair off? Another thing is, in the ancient world, hairiness was symbolic of wildness. And when you're in a culture, you're civilized, you're not wild, and so you wouldn't want to have a lot of hair because that's a symbol of wildness. So there's a lot of reasons why, but the point being is, it wasn't a big deal to Joseph. He didn't say like, "Oh no, I can't change my hair. I can't put different clothes on." It says he changed his raiment. He probably put Egyptian style clothes on. He's going before the king of Egypt. So he styles himself as an Egyptian. So that tells me that what we wear is not always that important. You know, we get stuffy about whether or not the pastor has a tie on. Not me, I'm talking about the pastor. Right? Does he have a tie on? Is he wearing a full suit? I don't think the Bible teaches that that's a big deal. That's my opinion. All right, and also in chapter 50, verse 26, talking about burial and the practices of how what do you do when somebody dies? Well, when Joseph died, it says that he was 110 years old, and they embalmed him. Who are they? Who embalmed him? Well, we all know that Egypt was famous for embalming. So there's a good chance that they made Joseph into a mummy. They mummified him. And it says that they put him in a coffin in Egypt. I had it in here, but I didn't. I gotta go. Oh my goodness, I'm over. But they found in, like, up towards the delta of Egypt, you know, they found what they think is a statue of Joseph. He was a Semitic or Asiatic, is the term they used. Because remember that people in Egypt, what are they? They're African. Everybody thinks otherwise. They're African, okay? Especially early on. Now, people moved in and out, but early on they were African. So then you had Asiatics, which are your Middle Eastern, right, coming in, what we call Middle East, but they're Asia, right? They're coming in, and so this guy was an Asiatic. He was probably Joseph. It's really interesting. They found it. Look it up. Avaris is the name of the city. I think it had a different name later on. But anyway, there's a good chance that that's actually the tomb of Joseph. And they had a statue, and they found only the head and part of the shoulder. But it's a very Semitic or Asiatic, Middle Eastern type of face. And so Joseph was real. They're finding, every time they dig, they find something new. Anyway, okay. I'm sorry, I'm way over. I don't even remember what time I'm supposed to stop. That's how bad I am. Hendrick's going to drop at me later. Okay, so I had a conversation about this because my coworker, he works second shift, but he works the same job I do. So we like talk and, you know, pass details. Hey, yeah, I did this to that. You'll need to finish this, you know, that kind of stuff. Well, are you seeing the picture? Yeah, that's one part of my work area where we balance the rotors. So anyway, we're talking, and I said, well, I'm thinking about this culture has been going through my mind. And he said, you know, I could tell you some stuff about that. I was like, okay, so tell me. So he's originally from Louisiana. And whenever Hurricane Katrina happened, you know, a lot of people that were in Louisiana, they had to move up here for a while. And some of them said, you know what, I'm staying here. There are no hurricanes up here, really. I mean, they come, but they're more like tropical depression by the time they get to us. Let's take a breath between that sentence. Anyway, the point being is he said I would in Louisiana. I was born Catholic, so in essence, I really didn't go to church at all. But then when I became an adult, I became a, a, a it was a Pentecostal, but it's a really strict type of Pentecost. And he's like, they're the ones, you know, you got to wear long sleeves. Men have to be clean shaven, short haircut. Women have to grow their hair long and never cut it. Women have to wear skirts, you know, all that stuff. Yeah. UPC, is that that's it? Because I was like, UPC, like the code? But yeah, so he's telling me about all this, and he was really into it. But then when he moved away from that culture and he came down here, he said, because I was asking him, what do you think? What keeps people from receiving the truth? And he said, I think sometimes they have to be taken out of the culture they're in. Okay, well, that's interesting. Because that's what happened to him is he was in this culture, he got taken out of it and came here and joined a more what we would call liberal Pentecostal church. I don't know if that's the right term. You're shaking your head. What? Okay, tell me later. Uh-huh. That's here. See, I'm not real up on all that. But anyway, the point being is he joined a church that wasn't like that. He started to figure out some things. And here's one of the texts he brought up. I thought that's a good point. So because they're all about the outward appearance, right? And this is one of the texts that they would use. I will therefore that men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands without wrath and doubting. In like manner also that women adorn themselves in modest apparel with shamefacedness and sobriety, not with broaded hair. In other words, plaited. One version says plaited hair. In other words, you're braiding it with gold and pearls and costly array, but which becometh women professing godliness with good works. And so that he was when he became a Christian, this is one of the verses that they, went over and over and over. And he goes, I looked at that verse and I looked at that verse. And he said, but you know what? I realized this isn't talking about how you dress. I was like, no? He's like, no, it's not talking about how you dress at all. Because it talks about good works. Well, a better verse is 1 Peter. That's the same concept, but it tells us what Paul over there in Timothy was talking about. So verse 3, whose adorning, let it not be outward adorning. Here's the plaiting of hair and wearing gold and putting on apparel. So Peter's saying, talking to the women, don't let that be your focus. Verse 4, but let it be the inward man of the heart, in which is not corruptible, even the ornament of a meek and quiet spirit, which is in the sight of God of great price. And I was like, oh, you're right, dude. I see what you're saying. It's not talking about the outward at all. It's talking about what's going on inside. That's a good point. And so that's what changed his mind. He said he had to be taken out of the culture he was in so that he could look at it from a distance and then realize, while I believe that verse is saying we should dress all lavishly and waste a lot of money on that, more importantly, it's telling us that we should have God decorating our heart, changing the way we are. And I was like, that's good. That's good. So go out and talk to people about religion, because not only can you help them see things, but they can help you see things. Now, sometimes it's a bad example, right? Oh, I ain't doing that. But sometimes it's a good example. And what is our protection? What did I tell you our protection is? The law of God. That's our protection. Because if you come to a person and they go, oh, yeah, you can sleep with any woman you want, you go, thou shalt not commit adultery. And you could even make that broader. You shouldn't be involved in fornication. That's all sexual sins. All right, I'm completely out of time. back to this culture idea. What should be the, see, it kind of looks like a wheel, right? What should be the hub of our culture? That's right. Jesus should be the hub of our culture. We should let him cultivate our culture, right? It's about cultivating. It's a thing that's controlled, it's changed, it grows, it moves. If we let Jesus do that, how great would our culture be? You could leave your doors unlocked because thou shalt not steal. Because you should love, oh, I think my computer just died. You should love your neighbor as yourself, right? So that should be the hub of our culture. Man, I'm lost without my computer. That's one way to tell the preacher to shut up, huh? Anyway, uh, so yeah, God is should be the center of our culture. You know, our culture should be in Christ. I had some verses that say it should be Christ and Christ alone. That's, I wish I could remember where they're at, but that's why I use PowerPoint because I can't remember stuff. So Jesus is coming back very soon. I think the more we realize how soon he's coming back, the more we need to make sure our culture is in harmony with the desires of God. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for the message that you give because I can't claim it. And thank you for reminding me I need to be quiet at some point. Lord, you love us so much, and it's just amazing how you work. Thank you, Lord, for your blessings and mercy. And I just pray that you'll continue to shape us and make us more like you. I pray all this in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.